welcome back. We're now moving from past to present. And talking of the present, I've been asked by some people over the break just to clarify a couple of items on the timetable. The timetable is broadly as in your packs. We are running 15 minutes late today, but we expect to make that up by curtailing the water break after this session to 5 minutes instead of 15 minutes. So it is still our intention to finish at 6:30 and then to go to the drinks reception after that. Tomorrow morning, we start here at 9:30 and then run through until just after 1 o'clock. Well, I don't think we could be in better hands for this next session. Professor Caroline Kennedy-Pipe is a professor of war studies at the University of Hull, where until recently she was also director for the Centre of Security Studies. Her research interests are many, to put it mildly. I've just selected some: the ethics of war, Cold War politics, terrorism, Russian foreign policy, IEDs, drones, and the effects of combat on women. She has spent time in Afghanistan doing field work, and her next book is on rethinking war, which is really what we're all about now. Caroline.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a huge pleasure to be here in Cambridge, and I would like to thank everybody who's put this really rather remarkable event together. I don't think there could be a more timely age for us to consider why are we fighting today. And again, it's a pleasure to have such a distinguished set of panelists who I'm sure you'll have read about in their biographical notes. But let me just say, Professor Nigel Biggar is a scholar, a teacher, and quite a rarity, I would say, for the UK. He's also a public intellectual. And he deals in the public domain with some of the most challenging and interesting questions of our times, in particular, and I link back to our previous panel, on our rights, obligations, and duties to those at the sharp end or the receiving end of conflict or tyranny. Sir John Holmes, he said I can call him John, but I'll stick with Sir John, is also a hugely distinguished public service servant. He's had a distinguished diplomatic career, and I think for more purposes, and very intriguingly for me, he was part of the formidable negotiating team and political team who brought an end to 30 years of war in Northern Ireland. And that in itself, I think, as we ponder why we are fighting today, leads me to believe that this voice of experience might also help us look at some of the intractable conflicts around the globe. It used to be said in my youth that if we could solve Northern Ireland, we could probably solve many of the contemporary politics and troubles of the world. So I look forward to hearing Sir John. And finally, but not least, of course, we have Sir Malcolm, also a distinguished politician and with a long career of public service to this country. He's held the highest offices of state, and I hear just now from Sir Malcolm that he has just been handed from the archives here some of his private correspondence with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. It will not, he assures me, appear in the Sunday papers. So we're going to go in alphabetical order, 10 minutes for each panellist, and then, of course, plenty of time for us to open a conversation on why we are fighting today. So if I could hand over to Professor Nigel.
Thanks very much. So the question is, yes, why are we fighting today? The question really invites an empirical answer, and I'm not an historian or a political scientist, I'm an ethicist. So I have to tweak the question in order to answer it. And the question I will answer is, what are the ethical reasons for our Britons fighting today, for example, in Syria and to a lesser extent in Libya? That's where I'll start. Well, we've all seen the behavior of so-called Islamic State. We've all been horrified by its tyranny and the cruelty of it. We've seen what they've done to the Yazidis and the Iraqis and the Syrians and others. And so part of our motivation in being party to bombing raids in Syria against Islamic State is undoubtedly humanitarian. And I should just point out that there is something of a tension between the the tradition of just war reasoning and international law. According to international law, the paradigm of a legal war is self-defense. According to the just war tradition, the paradigm is actually the rescue of the innocent from grave injustice. The doctrine of the responsibility to protect incorporates the just war tradition's thinking, but is not yet fully accepted by the UN General Assembly, and therefore is not yet wholly international law. So there is tension there. So one of the reasons that we are fighting in Syria is humanitarian. Also, it seems to me that since we are a member of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council, we have a special responsibility in Britain to provide military resources to support international law and order. That comes with the job of being a member of the Permanent Five. And so we have assumed our responsibility as a member of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council. And then third, you may remember that we took our decision to join our allies in bombing Isil in Syria, partly in response to France's appeals for support. So we're helping to support an ally who has suffered terrorist attacks which originate in Islamic State. So there we have, if you like, three morally laudable reasons for doing what we do. And if I can just take this opportunity to I think he's probably left the room, but were he here, I would try and discourage Sir Nick Horton from going too far down the Hobbesian route, because it seems to me that Hobbesianism is quite unrealistic about human motivation, that we evidently do care about far more than just preserving ourselves and avoiding pain. We are evidently moved by the appeals of justice and the grievances of injustice. If you want an example, take contemporary Chinese nationalism, which is considerably fueled by at least perceived injustice in the form of, let's say, the Opium Wars of the 1840s. Now, you may think that the grievance is overwrought, and you may think it doesn't justify saber rattling in the South China Sea. Nevertheless, it is an actual motive, indignation against injustice. So we have a series of morally laudable reasons for doing what we do. However, of course, our national interest is also engaged. But the first thing I want to say about that is that national interest is not of itself morally problematic. The interests of the British people are the interests of 60 million human individuals, 60 plus million. And while the British government may have and does have responsibilities to other peoples, it has a primary responsibility to this people. As the French political philosopher Yves Simon wrote in response to the crisis in Abyssinia in the 1930s, what truly would we say of a government that failed to take into account the interests of its people? So the fact that the British people are concerned about their prosperity and their security is nothing to be ashamed of. Of course, there are unjust ways of pursuing national interest, but that doesn't make national interest in itself morally suspect. So, what are our interests in fighting ISIL in Syria? Well, we have seen Islamic State-inspired atrocities in our neighbour France. We have seen the destabilizing effects of migration from Syria into Europe. And we know that a significant minority of Britons have been inspired by Islamic State's narrative. So we have an interest in seeing ISIL defeated. And it seems to me that the interest is entirely morally justified. So we've got a humanitarian motive, we have responsibility as a member of the Permanent Five, we have responsibility to an ally, France, and we have responsibility, the government has a responsibility to British security. And all those give us moral reasons to go to war against Islamic State in Syria and elsewhere. But that brings us to the difficult question of costs and risks. And here, let me make a side swipe at recent reports. Chilcot, the parliamentary reports on Syria and Libya, and also on the Joint Committee's report on the Yemen, where it seemed to me that each of these reports, whatever their other merits, suffers from a lust for certainty and an acute risk aversion that is quite impractical. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And insofar as this conference is about the way in which war and our attitude toward it changes, it seems to me that we can detect in our culture in general what seems to me an excessive aspiration to managerial control, which has all sorts of side effects which are not taken into account. And I see some evidence of that in recent parliamentary and other reports on international relations. When it comes to estimating costs and risks, we cannot expect mathematical or scientific precision. So I agree with Sir Hugh Straughan's earlier remark. I mean, I think the fog of war, if it ever was lifting, I don't think it ever did lift, actually. I think there's a considerable fog out there, and it's not likely to lift entirely. With regard to costs, part of the problem is that the goods and evils we have to weigh up when thinking about going to war are incommensurate. There's no common way of measuring them. To make the point, if I were to ask the question, how much is justice worth? How many lives of British soldiers or civilians is it worth trying to beat Isil? I think even to ask the question is to demonstrate that it's not possible to answer. If you were a typical Anglo-Saxon audience, and being Cambridge, you're probably not typical, but if you were typical, 90% of you would think that the war against Hitler was justified. And of course, regime change in Berlin in 1945 was a very good thing. But it did cost the lives of between 60 and 80 million human beings, and it did inadvertently hand over half of Europe into the tender mercies of Stalin. So the outcome of that war, however we think it was justified, was very messy, just like Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think in terms of trying to estimate with precision what the costs will be and whether the goods outweigh the evils, it's really not possible to answer it in that fashion. And as for risks, well, of course we should be conscious of what risks we're taking, but we shouldn't pretend to be able to control the future. We can estimate the risks as conscientiously and with maximal information, and because the future is often in other people's hands, and because victory can turn upon a change in the wind, no matter how conscientious we have been, our estimate of the risks may be wrong, and I think we need to be realistic about that. But how then do we assess costs and risks? Well, it has to be in terms of what resources we have available, and it has to be in terms of what we think is politically supportable. But what resources we are willing to commit and how much support we can raise depends crucially on the degree to which our national interest is engaged. And one of the problems, it seems to me, with recent interventions in, for example, Afghanistan and Iraq, is that our national interest in the first, in Afghanistan, was too remotely engaged, and our national interest in Iraq, as it turned out, was too little engaged. So our devotion of resources and our patience and our assumption of risk was limited. In 1940, with our army smashed in northern France, this country decided, thanks to Winston Churchill, to fight on. We had no exit strategy. We barely had a survival strategy. And we had no certainty of victory. We just hoped we might. We hoped we might. But we were willing to pay very high costs. We bankrupted ourselves. We mortgaged ourselves to the Americans for a generation or two. I think we only paid off our war debt about 6, 7, 8 years ago, because the stakes were so high, because our survival as a liberal democracy was at stake, and because, as Churchill put it, with our survival, the future of Christian civilization was at stake, as he put it. So the stakes were very high. If Syria happened to be geographically located where France is, it would be reasonable for us to devote very high levels of resource and to take very high risks, because our basic national interest, our basic security, would be very severely threatened. But because Syria is not where France is, because Syria is where Syria is, it doesn't make sense for us to, for example, put regular boots on the ground in any large numbers. And that's not entirely unreasonable. So if we are going to risk war with Russia, if we are going to try and persuade Mr. Putin that there are some red lines we are serious about, then it is arguable that it doesn't make sense for us to do that in Syria. But if not there, then we need to decide where exactly our red lines are and make sure that Mr. Putin knows what they are. Before I close, let me just summarize some of the main points I've made. So on the one hand, we are motivated and should be motivated by humanitarian concerns, by international responsibility, by, if you like, other regarding moral considerations. We're also partly motivated, as we must be if we're going to have political support for foreign interventions or foreign action. We're also motivated by national interest. That in itself is not morally problematic. It's quite reasonable for us to ask why our sons and daughters in uniform, or our brothers and sisters or fathers and mothers in uniform, why they have to be put at harm's risk in remote places like Syria. That's quite reasonable. Finally, I guess I want to say that it is difficult politically, it seems to me, and maybe those with political experience can comment on this, it's difficult to persuade us to pay very large costs and take high risks to fend off remote threats or indirect threats. And it's often difficult to judge when it's prudent to go to war and when it's more prudent not to go to war. There's no science to this. But I guess it seems to me that when trying to decide when it's prudent to go to war or not to go to war, we should remember that doing nothing also incurs costs and risks. Doing nothing is not costless or riskless. To quote, or rather to tweak a quote by Leon Trotsky, just because we aren't interested in war doesn't mean that war isn't becoming interested in us. In other words, doing nothing, standing still, is not riskless. I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I agree with a lot of what Nigel was saying. I'm going to come at this partly from my diplomatic experience, but also informed by my experience working for the United Nations from between 2007 and 2010 on the humanitarian side, where one had a particular way, particular standpoint from which to view conflicts going on and to see at very close quarters the effects of that on the ground. I mean, the question we've been put is, why are we fighting today? Actually, the question in a way is, particularly if you look at Syria, why are we not fighting today? I mean, we are fighting, as Nigel suggested, in terms of air power and special forces, no doubt, but we don't have any boots on the ground. So it's worth looking at why that's the case, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. But the recent history of the conflicts, which are most in our minds, these are not wars of national survival, as Nigel was saying. They're more about intervening in civil conflicts elsewhere, or, if you like, even if we're not intervening in a civil conflict, a war of choice, because we have some particular aim we wish to pursue. And some of those have been cases where the motives for doing this have been reasonably clear and where the actions have been reasonably successful. You can look at the Falkland Islands, obviously, Sierra Leone in a limited way, Kosovo, and the first Gulf War. Those had pretty clear motivations. The action was pretty successful, and the consequences, by and large, have been positive. The problem is that we've had some examples, and I think those had a heavy influence, for example, on why we went into Iraq the second time. But others of these more recent conflicts have been much less clear in their motivation and, to put it no higher, have been much less successful. Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya in particular. And what I think you can see when you look at these conflicts is you find a very confusing and confused mixture of motives and aims for actually embarking on them. Some of it's about national interest, although, as Nigel was suggesting, that's not very central in a very direct sense, and I would certainly dismiss the arguments of those who say some or all of these wars are about oil, for example. But there is a mixture of national interest, sort of broadly perceived in terms of protecting our own security in the long run. There's a degree somewhere there of what I might call post-imperial paternalism, the idea that we can somehow, from our Western, more civilized standpoint, fix other people's problems. There's sometimes a degree of messianism that we can improve the world, make it a better place. And then there is this question, which I will come back to a bit later, of real or supposed humanitarian concern. And actually what you find when you look at the debates about these things is the arguments shift at different times and a different emphasis. So those kind of motivations are not clear, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why the results have not been so good either. The other thing, when you look at some of these, is it's striking how hastily and lightly some of these decisions have been taken by governments, and I have been involved in some of that myself, so I'm not excusing myself in this. If you think about the huge risks to lives involved, if you think of the huge resources involved, I mean, much more so for the Americans than for us, but even for us in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's billions and billions of pounds. And if you think of the risks to our global reputation and our position involved in these conflicts, it's striking, as I say, quite how quickly and apparently lightly, anyway, I'm not saying that people haven't reflected on them, but how lightly in some respects these decisions are taken. I mean, if you compare that with the 30 years you take to decide where to build another runway at Heathrow, you could decide to go into Iraq, or certainly in Libya, from one day to another. Which is the more risky course, you might ask yourself. So that's, I think, just worth thinking about, why it is we sometimes don't appear to reflect enough before we rush into these things. And then it's striking in the cases we're talking about here, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, how far the unintended negative consequences of what we do, of what we've done, have dominated the aftermath. Iraq is obviously the biggest example of that, but not the only one. In parentheses, it's worth noting that terrorism has been a big driver of these conflicts recently. I mean, I would argue myself that terrorism is a serious problem, but not an existential threat. The politicians don't tend to view it that way because of the way it's perceived by the public and the media, although they encourage that as well. And I agree with the comment somebody else made about the nonsensical global war on terror formulation. Terrorism is not is a method, not an ideology in itself. But it has been a big driver of our responses. But again, if you look at the results of that, obviously if you have an event like 9/11, there has to be a security response in some form. But if you have a response which is too dominated by security, I would argue that the consequences may not be what you intend. And I think there's not much doubt if you look at what we've done since 9/11, when by we I mean the West, we have made the problem of terrorism considerably worse by our efforts, despite what we intended to do. So how did we allow this to happen, and why have these things been so difficult? I think the first thing to say is this is not a military difficulty. In all these cases, the military campaign has been extremely successful and rapid and much more successful than people imagined, at least in the initial stages. Of course, it gets much more difficult later on when you're facing asymmetric warfare and insurgencies and so on. But the problem has not been a military one. The problem is after that initial success, we have proved particularly inept politically and diplomatically in what we do next. I mean, again, in parenthesis, and somebody's already mentioned this, I think there is a case that generals and the Ministry of Defence in particular, in general, have been perhaps very quick to say what we can do militarily and leave worrying about whether it's a good idea to somebody else like the Foreign Office, which of course it is the Foreign Office's job. But I think it's incumbent upon the military and the MOD in general to think about those broader consequences as well and be ready to tell truth to power if necessary. But I think it's also, some of these decisions have been influenced, or not influenced perhaps is a better way of putting it, by our lack of belief in, reliance on experts who actually know what they're talking about when they're talking about some of these countries. Again, Iraq is a particular example. If you looked at what happened in the 1920s, you might have anticipated what would happen later. And Afghanistan, somebody's already mentioned that, invading Afghanistan has never been a good idea. The first rule of international life is don't invade Russia, and the second is don't invade Afghanistan, because it doesn't work. But I think we have had this problem of, faced with these kind of problems and decisions of wanting to just ignore the sort of naysaying, no can-do opinions of experts, and that's helped to lead us into error. And we've proved particularly bad at nation building. So if you look at the recent examples, Afghanistan and Iraq are again, and Libya too, are really very poor examples of that. And again, I think nation building is an extremely difficult thing to do, so I'm not suggesting there are easy ways of doing it, and perhaps that's a reason not to try in some respects. But we have had a lack of understanding of the societies we're operating in, an over-reliance on elections as the sort of panacea for problems of leadership, a failure to build on what is there, and a tendency to import ideas from the outside and try to impose them, which clearly doesn't actually work. By the way, also our ability to bring conflicts to an end, not only in the places we've intervened in, but elsewhere, seems to have become much less. So that's the context in which I think we're operating here. Just a couple of points on the justifications for intervention. This is not a comprehensive discussion on that, it would take far too long. On the legality point, there is a theory that international law is clear, that unless you have a UN Security Council resolution, any intervention is bound to be illegal or illegitimate. I don't actually happen to share that view. I think a Security Council resolution is always desirable, if possibly achievable. But there can be situations where you might want to intervene, even if there isn't a UN Security Council resolution. And unfortunately, international law is not like national law. It's somewhat full of holes and vague where it needs not to be. And the second point is about the humanitarian justification for intervention. As I say, I come at this from a particular angle, having worked at the UN. My observation was that with one or two exceptions, the people who talked about humanitarian intervention were never humanitarians. They were always politicians. The humanitarians tended to see the disadvantages of intervening because killing one group of people to save another is always a slightly tricky business. How do you measure up one set of lives against the other? But again, the fear that the unintended consequences of what you're doing may outweigh your good intentions, as it were, is very real. A lot of people attached a lot of hope to the doctrine of responsibility to protect, where the international community could find a way of intervening where a national government had failed its own people. I think which is an admirable principle, but the trouble is it doesn't give you a guide to action in any particular circumstance. You still have to make the decision, so it hasn't actually helped us. And all this has been complicated by the fact that most of these conflicts are taking place not between classical armies, but they're taking place in the middle of the civilian population. So the proportion of civilian casualties in all these conflicts has been rising, and although there's a lot of pious talk about avoiding civilian casualties, actually the reality is rather different. So finally, why are we not fighting more in Syria? When in some cases, or in some respects, the case might seem rather obvious. I was quite struck, there was a debate, I think it was actually this morning, and maybe yesterday morning, on the Today programme about Syria and the awful things happening in Aleppo. And John Humphrey says, well, of course, we know exactly what to do in Syria, or in Aleppo. And I thought, well, actually, that's exactly what we don't know. We have no idea what to do in Syria, given the situation we're in, because of the complexities of Assad, ISIS, Russians, etc., etc. But I think it's also more than that. I think we have been so burned by our recent experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya We think we've kind of tried everything. I mean, we tried intervening very sort of directly and obviously, both militarily and politically in Iraq. It didn't work. We tried intervening remotely in Libya and leaving the rest to the locals, and that didn't work. So we run out of ideas, basically. So we simply don't know what to do in Syria, so we don't do much. Now, I'm not criticizing that necessarily. I mean, doing nothing is always an option. And, you know, it's quite often quite a good option, although politicians don't like it very much because it doesn't tend to look very active. But still, doing nothing is an option. But I mean, the more serious fundamental point behind that is that there has been a huge division in the international community about the merits of interventionism. Should we intervene in other people's countries to correct what we see as humanitarian concerns or injustice or whatever it might be, or not? I mean, the West has tended to argue we should because we have an obligation to respect, even enforce, international standards of human rights and so on. The Russians and the Chinese and most of the global South have said, no, you don't. And that's just an excuse for pursuing your own interests. That divide is still there. We haven't resigned from our principle, but we've been burned by the experience of recent years to be much more careful about it. The Russians have had long enough since their own experiences in Afghanistan that they started again in Syria, which they may come to regret at some point. But that big divide is still there. The pendulum in the West has swung against interventionism. Of course, given time, as I just suggested with the Russians, it may swing back again. We may find that in some future conflict we're more ready to intervene. The public is more ready to intervene than we are at present. Let me stop there. Thank
you. And now Sir Malcolm Rifkind.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to follow such a distinguished ambassador. I was once told that ambassadors were people who could be disarming, especially when their countries were not. And we can all think of examples of that phenomenon. I agreed with virtually everything he said, except one particular remark. Unless I misunderstood you, John, I wasn't comfortable with. You said that you thought our response to terrorism over the last 20 years had made things worse. If that is indeed your view, I do disagree. And I would simply say, look, you know, when 9/11 happened, way back, 15, 16 years ago, how many people would have assumed that here we were 15 years later and terrorists had been unable to repeat that scale of destruction and of terrorist atrocity in the United States again? I certainly assumed we had entered a new world where this was going to become a more regular feature of our lives. And here in the United Kingdom, we had our worst terrorist experience in the June 2005 bombings in London when 60 or 70 people were killed. But it's the only example so far, and I'm conscious of the fact that could be changing as I speak, but so far that is the only example of a mass terrorist success in the United Kingdom. So I don't think it's correct to say that in the level of protecting our own citizens in their own countries, that the response has not been broadly successful so far, not that that implies any complacency as to where we are now. I listened to my former military colleagues in the last session, and there was a discussion about how ministers and generals and admirals and air marshals reach agreement. I think we did reach agreement, but it was partly an agreement as to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. So the question of whether you use the military in the first place had to be a matter ultimately for the politicians to decide. But it was a foolish minister that tried to tell his generals or his admirals how to fight a war once that decision had been taken. I wouldn't describe that as a policy of consensus. I remember being present when Margaret Thatcher, who was my boss at the time, was asked whether she believed in consensus as a way of resolving difficult issues. And of course, we all knew she had no time whatsoever for consensus. But to our surprise, she said, yes, I do believe in consensus. And we said, you do? She said, yes, I believe there should be a consensus behind my convictions. At the time, I thought she was joking, but as the years have gone by, I've realized she was absolutely serious. I think there is a crucial point about civilian control of military actions. Ultimately, questions of war and peace are not, or at least should not, be taken by the militaries themselves. And I had a startling example of the problems this can produce. When I was Minister of Defence in the early 1990s, my first visit to overseas, one of my first visits, was to the newly independent Ukraine. It had just become a separate country. And I remember vividly my first meeting with my Ukrainian counterpart, the Minister of Defence in Kiev. And on our side of the table, there were 6 of us, 5 of whom were civilians, and the only person in uniform was the defense attaché, a half-colonel, sitting on the far end of our side of the table. On the other side, there were 6 full generals, including the minister, in full military uniform. And my host, General Morozov, the Minister of Defense, welcomed me to Kiev and said, "We are, as you know, now an independent country. We hope that to become more like the West, do you have any advice as to what we might do?" And I couldn't resist it. I said, "Well, one of the things you might like to bear in mind is what civilian control of the military. And you can see, obviously, the distinction on the 2 sides of this table." And not a word was said until the following morning. All 6 of them appeared wearing lounge suits. And the minister said, "Well, you satisfied?" I said, "Well, it's a step in the right direction." Let me make a number of comments, if I may, on the general issues that we're addressing at this moment. And it's worth remembering that for most of human history, war took place between states. And it took place either by one state wishing to extend its territory or another state wishing to defend itself from being attacked by a military response. Now, I don't want to oversimplify it or generalize too much, but to a very significant degree, that's not the world we've lived in since 1945. Certainly, for the most part, and I don't just mean in Europe, throughout the world as a whole, we have not had that many state-to-state wars. And that is for very obvious reasons. That in the 20th century, first of all, there are fewer border disputes. Most of the frontiers between countries, not just in Europe, but in Latin America and North America, obviously, even in Africa and most of Asia, have already been determined. They're not in dispute. But in addition to that, for the most part, there are no longer empires or countries aspiring to be empires. And the whole point about being an empire was to aggrandize yourself, to expand your territory, and that normally required military conquest. But there are other more modern reasons as well. And one of them, and again, I don't want to oversimplify it, but nuclear weapons have had their impact. I think particularly of the ongoing deep differences between India and Pakistan. And it's a very disturbing fact, but one difficult to deny, that before they both had nuclear weapons, they went to war, 3 or 4 times, serious civilian wars, conventional wars, over the years. From the time they both became nuclear powers, they have not resolved their problems. Kashmir still remains as bitter a dispute as ever, but they have drawn back from even conventional conflict because of the awareness that that could lead to something far worse. And there's a fourth consideration as well why war has changed in terms of its motivation, and that's because you can't any longer in the 20th century, as we know to our cost, have wars that do not include massive civilian casualties. And because most of our societies, at least in the West, are democratic societies, the force of public opinion has prevented the old-style wars being contemplated to the degree that would otherwise have been possible. And even Mr. Putin today, much mention of Mr. Putin, is very conscious that if he ever gets to the stage they got to in Afghanistan, when they occupied Afghanistan and the body bags were coming home to Moscow, that his own position in Russia would be severely weakened. So the kind of military conflict that he has permitted tends to fall short to a significant degree of that kind of risk. Now, one change that has taken place, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and other colleagues have touched on this, is what became known as liberal interventionism. It was this triumphalist period of several years, perhaps a decade, more than a decade, after the end of the Cold War, when America and Britain in particular, Mr. Blair's famous or notorious Chicago speech, when he said we have this ethical obligation, he argued, to use the extraordinary military supremacy that the West currently has, to use that to achieve ethical objectives. And of course, the first example of that was Kosovo, and the second example was Iraq. And if the question of liberal interventionism as a justification for war has been discredited, it's for several reasons. It is, of course, partly because it departed from the traditional assumption that you only went to war. The concept of just war implied there was a need to defend yourself and there was no alternative or something of that scale. The problem with liberal interventionism was that it overlooked the fact that while the military objective could be realized relatively quickly and without many casualties on either side, but particularly on the side of the United States or the United Kingdom, was this incredible military superiority we had over the countries that we chose to intervene in. Somebody once said of the United States, it isn't just a superpower, it's a super-duper power, primarily because of its military as well as its economic and diplomatic clout. But what the politicians failed to understand, although they were warned at the time, was that, yes, you will win that initial military conflict against Saddam Hussein or in Kosovo or wherever, and I include Kosovo. But what you can't control is the political vacuum that you have created and how that is then subsequently filled. Because you're not contemplating a permanent occupation of the country concerned. You want to get the hell out as soon as you can, having won the military conflict. When Britain went to India, it went there to stay 200-300 years. And India adjusted itself to the permanence of British occupation until the 20th century. But the knowledge that the West was going to get out as soon as it could meant that the internal players jockeyed for power in a most extraordinary and dramatic fashion. And I say I include Kosovo for this reason, because although I'm well aware of the ethical objectives of stopping ethnic cleansing and matters of that kind, even in Kosovo, there were two fundamental things that went wrong, which have not been sufficiently recognized. When NATO began its bombing of Serbia, of Milosevic, in Belgrade, the statements by NATO at that time were, this is going to last 2 or 3 days, and then Milosevic will concede. It didn't. It took 2 months of constant bombing. They even ran out of targets. And it was only the threat of sending ground forces in that made Milosevic concede. And when the Kosovo operation began, this public assurance by NATO powers, including the United States and the United Kingdom, was this is not about an independent Kosovo. There's no question of an independent Kosovo because the fragmentation of the Balkans would be too serious. What we want is stop ethnic cleansing and autonomy for Kosovo within Serbia. Now, I'm not arguing whether independence was good or bad. What I am saying was that the outcome of that conflict was very different to the beginning of it. I don't blame the Kosovar Albanians. They knew that having NATO on their side was the one opportunity they'd ever get of becoming an independent state. But it's had long-term consequences, because it is one of the reasons that persuaded Moscow that the West wasn't to be trusted. And that because their view was ignored, because there was no United Nations authority for that particular conflict, that became then a major problem. Let me make one other point, if I may. I was Defense Secretary during the Bosnian conflict. And one of the big issues, and there was a lot of criticism at the time, was neither the British government nor the French or the European countries would intervene as competents to help the Bosnian government and stop Milosevic. There's 2 points that have to be made about that. First of all, yes, the judgment that was made, not just by ministers, but also overwhelmingly by public opinion in the various countries concerned, was that this had more of the features of a civil war to redraw the boundaries of the former Yugoslavia. And although Milosevic was the bad guy, there's no question about it, he was the person responsible for the ethnic cleansing, there was insufficient justification for the West to use as combat forces a military intervention. We did send tens of thousands of soldiers in, Britain, France, and other countries, as a humanitarian force, which probably saved 100,000 lives. But we weren't there as combatants. And I remember thinking at the time as Defense Secretary that the troops that I had responsibility under the Prime Minister for, they knew that they might have their lives put at risk if Britain was being attacked and they had to defend Britain. They knew that their lives might be put at risk if there was some supreme national interest or major national interest even if it wasn't the prospect of invasion, that required a British military response. But was it ethically right to actually go in as a combatant into somebody else's civil war, where there was not an obvious British national interest at stake, when our soldiers, sailors, and airmen might end up losing their lives or being severely injured? They would do it if we required them to, but was that really a justifiable exercise? A couple of other short points, if I may. Although we don't have state-to-state wars, what of course we've seen is that wars continue, but they're asymmetrical. There are governments on one side using conventional armed forces, and they're either terrorists or insurgents on the other. And the crucial thing about all these terrorists and insurgents, with the one exception of Islamic State, is their at least short to medium-term objective is not to control territory. It is to either advance their ideological point of view or to change the government of the country in which they are insurgents, but not to change international boundaries. And therefore, that is a much more difficult task for a conventional armed forces to deal with, because it's not what they've been trained to do. They are in part nowadays trained to make a contribution there, but it's not been historically their primary purpose. One other point, that what we have seen, and it's particularly Russia is the best example of this, but other countries are also involved, is that you cannot make a conventional distinction between a military solution and other means of non-military activity to achieve the same objective. Because what we are seeing now, and Russia, as I say, is the best example of this, is what could be called total war, where you have conventional military forces, where you have economic sanctions, where you have cyber attacks, where you have proxies, little green men who you can deny are anything to do with you, actually carrying out the military activity, as we see in eastern Ukraine. And all of that produces an overall impact of a kind that is deniable by the government most involved. So Russia, at this very moment, denies that it is militarily involved in eastern Ukraine. Denies either that its troops are there or its military equipment's there. Everybody knows that's untrue. But it enables them to maintain a public position, which is incompatible with the facts and which is different to what has been said in the past. One very final comment about Mr. Putin. He is being very successful, but he's being successful for a reason. He is willing to use his military force in a way that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Western countries have not been willing to in either Ukraine or in Syria. And there's a reason why he's prepared to, not just because he's an authoritarian leader. It is because his perception of Russian national interest is that the national interest, particularly in Ukraine, less or so in Syria, the Russian national interest in trying to control chunks of Ukraine is so vital that the ultimate use of your military capability is justified and necessary. The West, for equally convincing reasons, has taken the view that although we are deeply concerned about the destabilization of Ukraine, there is an insufficient national interest that would justify us going to war, not just in Ukraine, but with Russia in order to deal with the question of Ukraine. The point we will have to address, and we are having to address it already, is while we can reach that distinction, and I think it's the right one in the case of Ukraine, if, being opportunistic, Mr. Putin sought similar results, let us say in the Baltic states, members of NATO, members of the European Union, countries much more contiguous with Western and Central Europe. Our legal position under the NATO treaty is quite clear. We have to demonstrate that it's not just words, but that it reflects a political will, if necessary, to use our full military capability to defend members of the NATO alliance. If we're not prepared to do that, then it's not just the Baltics who would be let down and betrayed. The alliance would have become worthless, and we would have to come to terms with a Russian hegemony in a large part of our own continent.
So if we can open the floor for comments, questions to our panellists, and if you could wave your hand, a microphone will be brought to you. And if you could say who you are, please. So there's a lady up there.
My name's Connie Kimpton from Long Road Sixth Form College. I'm an A-level student. I was wondering whether the ideological West is heavily mentioned a lot when discussing war, and whether kind of political superpowers and international organisations like the UN, which has been talked about, have negative effects on the rest of the world, given that you're kind of pressuring them to believe similar views to us, and if so, do we have a duty to reduce those political superpowers?
Thank you.
I didn't quite catch the full thrust of that.
I think, shall I repeat it back because we're having some difficulty up here, that a lot of the panel have talked about the values of the West and the imposition of Western values through the use of the military instrument, and whether we should try and mitigate that emphasis and perhaps understand other viewpoints.
Okay, difficult question. I mean, I think that the values that the West puts forward are, I would say, the right values and are universal values. And I don't think we should be apologetic about promoting them. I think that's the first part of my response. The second part is I think we are very bad, and have been very bad, at understanding where other countries are coming from. We have been too ready to assume that we are civilization and we have a duty to bring that civilization to others, and therefore reluctance to understand the points of view of other people, and sometimes readiness to trample on their sensitivities and interests in ways which don't do us any credit. So I think we need to be very careful about imposing our values on other people. I think there's a difference between promoting them and attempting to impose them. I think in some cases, as I was suggesting, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, we have been trying to create societies which look more like ours, but in ways which fundamentally are not going to work in the situations in which these countries find themselves. It's very hard to think of, for example, I mentioned elections as an alternative. Very difficult to think of an alternative to elections as a way of finding a leadership to take over from a leadership you just deposed. How are you going to do that? You can't simply appoint your own dictator. That would be even worse. But the point is, elections don't make a democracy. A democracy is a much more long-term construction effort. So you need to be very careful about regarding elections as I say, as a panacea for what you're doing. So I think we do have to be much more hesitant about using our power, about trying to impose our values, but I don't think we should accept that our values are just another set of values which other people have just as good values. I mean, for example, I don't think Russian values are the ones we should be aspiring to. Even, I mean, they would say that, but I don't think they are. So that's the distinction I would draw.
Yeah, I certainly accept that we should not seek to impose on any country the political system under which they are going to operate. That must be for these people themselves living in that country to decide. But what I do reject in its entirety is the argument that is often made, usually by authoritarian leaders of some of these countries, that what they're rejecting is not freedom or democracy, it's Western values, as if somehow these are values peculiar to one part of the world. It's worth remembering what's happened just in our own lifetime in the last 30 years. The end of the Cold War was not just the end of a conflict with the Soviet Union. We have seen an extraordinary growth of two things, democratic government and the rule of law. Partly, of course, in Central Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, and these the countries that were part of the Soviet bloc. But it's in that same timescale that virtually the whole of Latin America, which used to be notorious around the world for being run by generalissimos and military coup d'etat and so forth, the whole of Latin America, South America and Central America, are now democratic countries with the one exception of Cuba. With the one exception of Cuba, it's the only one. And in the Far East, Taiwan, which is a Chinese country, is now a practicing democracy, having renounced dictatorship 25 years ago, as is South Korea, a former dictatorship, Indonesia, one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, a functioning democracy. These are all not Western values, these are the universal values that we are told are somehow peculiar to countries in Europe or North America. It's not true. One final point. This is not just about democracy when we talk about universal values. Equally important is the rule of law. And I remember vividly a conversation I had when I was Foreign Secretary with the Chinese Foreign Minister, and it was in the final stages of the negotiations of the future of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was being transferred back to China. We had no choice in that matter. And I was involved in the very last 2 or 3 years of these negotiations. And in this particular conversation with Chen Chi-chen, the Chinese minister, in Beijing, I had just come from Hong Kong, and I said to the Chinese minister, I hope you will appreciate that for the people of Hong Kong, what is crucial when they become part of the People's Republic is not just that they might be able to vote for more than one candidate when they have an election. What most worries them is they will not continue to be able to enjoy the rule of law. And I've never forgotten his reply. He said, Mr. Rifkind, you don't need to worry. We in China, we too in the People's Republic, we believe in the rule of law. In China, the people must obey the law. And I said, now hold on a moment. Hold on. I said, when we talk about the rule of law, we don't just mean the people must obey the rule of the law. The government must be under the law, must be able to be instructed by independent judges when they have broken the law. He not only didn't agree with me, he hadn't the faintest idea what I was talking about. Nor would Mr. Putin. That's what they have in common. It's not rule of law. In China, and sadly in Russia, it's rule by law, which is something very, very different. And we should never let people imagine these are simply Western ideas.
I'll try not to repeat what's already been said so well. I will say, however, that with all due respect to Sir John, and probably Sir Malcolm too, I don't think that liberal interventionism has been discredited. I think it has been chastened. I'm a chastened liberal interventionist. Now, why would I want to intervene at all? So here's one reason, that while I recognize that clearly the attempt simply to hoist onto very foreign cultures Western liberal democratic institutions, elections, etc., and to expect them to take to a political system we have spent several centuries developing was naive and foolish. So that I'm very open to the notion that there are a variety of forms of sufficiently responsible government. I mean, we've only had universal suffrage in this country for under 100 years. And the notion that no tolerable political just system existed until 100 years ago is nonsense, right? So I'm chastened. There may well be non-liberal democratic forms of government that are sufficiently just. On the other hand, there are forms of government that seem to me to be egregiously tyrannical. I think Saddam Hussein's state was one, actually. If you want a graphic instance of its tyranny, then look at pages 351 to 2 of Justin Marazzi's book Baghdad, where you will find a description of what appears on videos taken by the state's Special Treatments Department of what they did to political prisoners. One instance is that of putting a prisoner's head in a metal vise and squeezing it until his brains came through his nose. We know that because we can see it. Now, I'm quite sure there were many Iraqis who were deeply glad to see the end of the Saddam Hussein regime. And if you want to ask a hostile witness, ask Emma Skye, who opposed the invasion, but reports that she was shocked to land in Baghdad. She was armed with excuses as or apologies for Western intervention, only to find that so many of the Iraqis she met were delighted to see the end of Saddam Hussein. The notion that Westerners and non-Westerners have completely different ideas as to what just government looks like is wrong. So I think there may well be people out there who need our help. The question of how we not only get rid of the state, but help build something better is something we have to learn about. But I don't accept, even in the case of Iraq, that what we did simply didn't work. Two reasons for that. One is I had a group of young Iraqis in my office in Oxford 5-6 years ago, talking about various things, and at the end of it I couldn't stop myself. I said, so do you think we should have invaded in 2003? And the most articulate English-speaking one of them clearly had answered this question before and said, it was good that it happened, it could have been done better, and it's not over. Second thing is, if you look about 3 years ago, an article by Anthony Lloyd in Prospect magazine tells you all the positive things that have happened in Iraq since then. So I don't want to say that the invasion and the occupation wasn't a mess. It was somewhat corrected by the surge, nor do I want to say that all the effects have been good. They haven't. But to say that what we achieved was simply negative or nugatory, I think is not true. And just on Afghanistan, I don't want to put you in the hot seat, Hugh, but so John said that Afghanistan didn't work, but judging by your article in the FT 2 weekends ago, that's not entirely true. But anyway.
Thank you. Sorry, that gentleman there.
Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's great. Sorry, this young gentleman here.
I already
sorry.
asked a question, so maybe I'm happy to ask.
Well, we can go. We've got time for one, and then
Okay,
the gentleman
sure.
behind you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. I'm Matteo Mirolo again, a student in politics here. I thought Sir Malcolm made a fascinating point about Putin's asymmetry of war in Syria because of an asymmetry in the way national interest is perceived. And I wanted to draw the debate on this question of national interest. And forgive me if my question seems politically incorrect or naive. What is the influence of national interest, especially in economic terms? I'm thinking about energy, I'm thinking about arms trade, in British foreign policy. And what is the way in which national interest could be better explained to the people if we want to look at the future of war?
Well, I think you've got to go back to why we have armed forces in the first place. Why do we have people who are specially trained and have powers which nobody else has to use military equipment to enforce decisions that would not otherwise be achieved? And that is because ultimately, it's a bit like having a police force. Ultimately, without that, we are subject to either invasion or denial of our liberty or destruction of our economic integrity. So that's what we mean when we talk about national interests. And therefore, because the use of your armed forces, if they're going to be used in a combat role, nowadays they're often used for humanitarian or other reasons, civil help to the civil power. But if they're being used as combat forces, you're asking people, your own citizens, to risk their lives for the nation. And that's no small request to make, even if they are voluntary soldiers, even if they've chosen that career. They value their lives as much as the rest of us do. So you have to have not just an ethical justification, but I think in the wider sense, you have to have a constitutional justification to ask people to make what is often called the supreme sacrifice.
I mean, I would just comment that I hinted at this in what I said, that people often say, well, we intervene in Iraq and Libya because of oil. I've always regarded that as an absolutely ludicrous argument, because if we wanted oil, there was 1,000 better ways of getting it, cheaper and more effective ways of getting it than invading either of those countries. You just had to do deals with the dictator. That was perfectly simple, really. But the question of what your more indirect national interest is very difficult. Actually, I'm not sure that Putin, I mean, I would agree with you, Malcolm, on Putin's direct national interest in Ukraine, as he sees it. Syria is much less obvious from that point of view. Syria looks much more like Putin trying to make a point to the West, that you can't go on intervening to overthrow regimes. I'm going to defend them, and you're not willing to do that anymore. And he's been doing that rather effectively in a very cynical sort of way. So that's why when we're talking about interventionism, liberal interventionism, whatever you want to call it, it gets very difficult to explain exactly where your national interest lies when you have a recent history of failure. I mean, I agree. Afghanistan is a mixed case. It's the end. The end of that story is not obvious. I think Iraq, I'm afraid, is obvious. And when I said I think our response to terrorism has made more terrorists, I was thinking particularly of Iraq. I mean, Iraq was not supposed to be a response to 9/11, but in some ways it was, at least from an American point of view. And it's, I think it's a very strong case that what we did in Iraq, not intentionally obviously, has helped create, I wouldn't put perhaps stronger than that, Islamic State, which is a more dangerous phenomenon than Al-Qaeda ever was. Now, our homeland response has been effective, both in the US and the UK, less so elsewhere perhaps, but the broader context of making life difficult for terrorists as opposed to creating more of them, I think has been a failure. Now, you can argue that point, and that was actually one of the key Blair arguments about Iraq, actually, is if we don't do something about Saddam Hussein, eventually the weapons of mass destruction he has will finish up in the hands of terrorists, and then where will we be? But people start to sort of get very nervous at that point about the remoteness of the national interest you're actually talking about, given the directness of the risks you're taking.
I mean, I think, if I can add, you asked about the narrative. I mean, in Western political thought since Rousseau, the idea has been that evil can be mitigated, that men aren't inherently evil, but that social structures can bring about redemption. So I think underpinning lots of Western interventionism has been this idea that reconstruction of social structures at the will of the people, and that's absolutely paramount, brings about a much better outcome in terms of peace and global politics. So you asked about the narrative. I think it's not just about national interest. I think it's a broad and Western political agenda that politics has become a form of moralism, and that moralism must be the will of the people. And it links back to the earlier question that this is the mission that drives many Western states, including the United States, that we can somehow remake man and evil if the social structures represent the will of the masses, whether the masses want it or not. And I think that's the point. Sorry. And sorry, you've been waiting a very long time, sir. Sorry.
Thank you, Steve Cooper. I'm glad the issue of just war has emerged, but I'm still not clear in my mind whether a legal war is exactly the same as a just war. But then I want to move it on a sec, because there will be a time when each country will decide this is either a legal war, a just war, or we want to go to war. When the actual decision is made to go to war, or is being made whether we go to war, is it a Brexit? Is it a cost-benefit analysis? Can we be assured that there is some sort of rigour rather than political knee-jerk?
Can I take you back to the beginning of your question, because you asked it in the previous session, which was about just war, whether just wars have to be legal. So, Nigel, I don't know.
Yeah. So in my remarks, I think I said, yes, that there's a tension between international law read strictly, and I'm really glad that Sir John alluded to the fact that actually that there are different ways of reading international law, but read strictly, the only kind of war that a state can engage in without reference to the Security Council is a war of self-defense. That's the paradigm. Whereas the tradition of just war thinking in the West, in the Christian West, as I said, doesn't regard self-defense as the paradigm. The paradigm of just war is the rescue of the innocent from grave injustice, which is expressed in the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which, as I said, is not yet, doesn't have the status of international law. Part of it was accepted by the UN General Assembly, but not the whole. But just to go back to international law, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer, but I have looked at this a bit. Although you won't be told this by lawyers who, when they make pronouncements on the legality of war are behaving as advocates. They're pushing a particular case. There are different ways of reading international law. So you've got the treaties, and those in particular who want to constrain American military intervention will be very strict about that. But others will say, well, it's not just the treaties, it's also international customary law, which is not written down in treaties. And sometimes lawyers will even appeal to morality. So, for example, there's an eminent Finnish philosopher and historian of law, Martti Koskiniemi, who has written that with regard to the Kosovo intervention, he said that most lawyers, and I can only take his word for it, most lawyers regard the Kosovo intervention by NATO as illegal, but moral. Right, so the answer to your question is, to what extent legality and morality or justice coincide partly depends on what reading of international law you take.
I think the point is it will always be a political view as to whether a particular war is justified or not, unless it's a very clear-cut case either of self-defence or where there's a UN Security Council resolution agreed by the Security Council acting together. I mean, the Kosovo War is an interesting example. People have argued, I mean, you're a lawyer, Malcolm, you can comment on this, that it was not legal because there was no UN Security Council resolution, because the Russians would have vetoed it, but we argue that would have been an unreasonable veto, not a sort of, whatever that may mean. But I mean, I think there is a sort of argument there. But it wasn't legal, but it was legitimate. And it was legitimate because the majority of the international community, as expressed in the Security Council General Assembly, agreed with it. That's what we claimed anyway. Whereas the Iraq War, those same people would argue, was both illegal because it wasn't explicitly supported by UN Security Council resolution and didn't have the support of enough of the international community to make it legitimate. Now, other lawyers would say you can't have a distinction between legality and legitimacy. That's a nonsense. But that's why, in the end, it's a rather political business.
Well, may I say, Edmund Burke once remarked that he didn't object to being governed by law, but he did object to being governed by lawyers. It's quite an important distinction. I think there's a huge difference between, or potentially a huge difference between just wars and legal wars. Sometimes the two can coincide. They can be both, but sometimes they can be one and not the other. If, for example, we had failed to get United Nations Security Council resolution for our actions in the Falklands, I think it still would have been a just war to send the task force to recover islands that had been occupied by a military junta and the citizens of which had been deprived of their freedom. I think that would have been a just war, even if the Security Council had refused to endorse it. As it happens, they did, but that was an additional bonus. The reverse is also true. I refuse to accept it just because the 5 permanent members of the Security Council happen to agree with each other. That immediately makes a war just and therefore ethical, because it's nothing of the sort. It's a political decision taken overwhelmingly for political reasons and which may or may not be just in its consequences. Nye Bevan, not exactly a sort of right-wing populist, once remarked, he once said, if there's anything worse than the slogan, "My country, right or wrong," it is the remark, "The United Nations, right or wrong." Because he knew, as we all do, that the UN doesn't have a corporate identity. It simply reflects the political judgments, particularly in the Security Council, of a very small number of governments.
Sorry. Yeah.
Hello, Chris Parry, former naval person, you know me already. I think looking at the Libya intervention is quite an interesting case here. Because we've got a UN resolution to protect the people of Benghazi, and then NATO unilaterally made the decision to go for regime change. And I think as a military operator, this is incredibly dodgy. And the direct result of that is when we tried to intervene against Syria, Russia and China said, you did us last time over Libya, so we're not going to support a humanitarian intervention into Syria the way you want it. And I have to say, there's been recent criticism of certainly the last Prime Minister on this by a House of Commons committee. And it bears much deeper analysis, I think, as to how the decision was made to go from protecting the people of Benghazi to removing Gaddafi because I don't think the audit trail is that clear, to tell you the truth. And it gets us in real trouble when you consider what has actually happened in Libya in terms of both legality and legitimacy. And I haven't got a question there. I just wonder if you could just do the O-level thing of discuss. Sorry, I'm old enough.
One of the points about the Libyan resolution is it did, I think for the first and only time, invoke the principle of the responsibility to protect. And a lot of people hoped this was the beginning of a new era where R2P would be, as it's known, would be routinely quoted. Unfortunately, the result has been entirely the opposite, that it's discredited it because of the way it was then used. Now, there is an argument, which is some validity, that if you wanted to protect the people of Benghazi, ultimately you're going to have to get rid of Gaddafi because otherwise, they were always going to be vulnerable. But I agree with you that it especially if you were sitting in Moscow or Beijing, it looked like you were given an inch and took several miles. And that's why they said never again. And that's where we are for the moment.
If I could just add to that, if I may, I think the original decision that was taken in good faith. The resolution that was passed by the Security Council was taken in good faith. This was to protect Benghazi. I think once that operation was already happening, and it was air power that was being provided by Western countries, then it gradually dawned on everybody that here was an opportunity just to, because the West hadn't started the war. This wasn't like the Iraq War. There was a rising of the Libyan people themselves who were battling against Gaddafi, and given that we had already got our air power protecting Benghazi, there was an opportunistic judgment made, which may not have been the right thing to do.
I mean, having looked at it militarily myself, there was a rising by the people in the east of Libya. And the reason that the war took so long is the people in the west of Libya were actually quite happy with Gaddafi.
Yeah, we don't know how happy they were, but you're right, the rising itself was in the east, but then there was this comparable rising in Misrata and a number of other parts of the west as the conflict continued.
And it's in some ways, it's as a military officer, what's quite interesting, the Iraq war I had problems with, because I wasn't sure whether it was a country going to war or a political party or a political person who went to university with me actually wanted this war. And then we see Libya, which actually, I have to say, and I said it at the time, the day after we started the war on the BBC, that I thought this was incredibly dodgy from a legitimacy point of view. This switch, we now know Gaddafi actually was going to say, look, as long as you don't send me to the International Criminal Court and find me somewhere to live, I'm happy to leave. And yet we ended up with the poor guy bombed on the road by a French jet, targeted assassination. Now, I've got no brief for Gaddafi, but I have to say I am not clear how we went from the purely military protection in Benghazi to regime change. Now, who do you think made that decision? Because I don't know.
Well, the people who made that decision were primarily the forces on the ground. We provided air power, air support. The actual fighting on the ground that drove Gaddafi out of Tripoli was done by Libyans.
But it was actually a specific war aim halfway through from NATO that we are going to remove Gaddafi. It's stated in public.
I don't know whether that was a specific war aim. It certainly, they continued the bombing long after it was necessary to protect Benghazi. That is a factual, correct statement. Where the decision was taken, I suspect it was taken simply on the basis we're in the middle of this operation. It's not yet complete. And there's an opportunity to get rid of Gaddafi as well.
Yeah,
it's irresistible. It's irresistible.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And I didn't shed many tears when they got rid of him.
Not me.
But can I, before you leave for a quick break, just thank our panel members. I think we've had a very thorough discussion of why we fight. And tomorrow, I think we're going to follow up a lot more about how we fight, which I think will be interesting. So could I ask you to thank our panel?